In this video, we will talk about how, using meta JavaScript, that is, without using various libraries, we can interact with a server through asynchronous requests. And in this video, we will go over two methods, XHR and the fetch method. So let's get started. And the first thing I suggest we do is come up with a URL where we can make synchronous requests. For this, there is, for example, a service called jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. And what is JSON placeholder? This is a fake online REST API for testing and prototyping. So, for our task of figuring out how we can send various requests, this is more than suitable. And if we look below, there are various examples and different resources. So, for example, in our case, we will use the URL users. I will open it in a new tab, and as a result, we get this JSON. So, I currently have a plugin installed, which is called, I believe, JSON View. It is called which takes and transforms JSON into such a readable format. But you will most likely just see plain text here. What is important for us here is that we can get this set of data from the given URL. And that's why we will work with this particular line. I will copy it from here and transfer it to WebStorm. Let's say I create a variable here called request URL and, for example, assign this value to it. So, we will be making requests to this URL and, essentially, everything is actually very simple. So, we tell JavaScript that we want to make a request to a certain address, pass it a string, configure the request, which we will go over now, and the request will be sent in the background, and then we will catch the response from the server. It might sound complicated, but let me show you that it's actually not quite so. The first method we will examine, as I mentioned, is an object called XHR. What is XHR? This is an abbreviation for XMLHttpRequest. Essentially, it is quite self-explanatory. And that's why, by the way, I created a file called XHR. Usually, we create an XHR variable through the constructor of the global class XMLHttpRequest, like this, and concatenate it, like this. And then we can work with the instance of this class and, accordingly, send some requests. For this, we first need to call a method on the XHR object called open, which will take and essentially open this new connection. And the first parameter we need to pass here is the method by which we will make the request. What are methods? Yes, there are basic methods such as get and post. For example, any requests when we open a web page on the internet are GET requests. If we submit a form, those are POST requests. However, in a REST API, there are also requests like PUT, patch, delete, and I believe there are more. The idea is that by choosing a specific method for the request, we specify exactly what needs to be done. That is, GET is intended for retrieving any data, POST for creating, delete, accordingly, for deleting, PUT for fully updating an item, patch for partially updating an item, and I think that's all. Accordingly, we simply pass the string get as the first parameter here, because in this case, we are now discussing how to retrieve some data from the server. But in this lesson, we will also cover how to work with sub-requests, because they have their own peculiarities. And as the second parameter, we pass a string here, which is the URL. In our case, it is the request URL. But now if I save everything and open the browser, and my project is actually very simple. There is an empty HTML page with a script connected to it. That is, if I open this specific HTML page in a browser, I won't see anything at all. Because it is not enough to just open the request, you also actually need to send it. So here I am referring to this XHR object and calling a method called send, but as we are sending it here. And now if I refresh the page in the browser, you still don't see anything, but that's logical because we aren't outputting anything to the console. How can we use Chrome DevTools to check that these requests are actually being sent? For this, you might be familiar with the Elements tab. Here, you can view the structure of the DLN tree. We have the console where we can type anything into the console. We have the source, where we can, for example, view the source code of this application. For instance, in the XHR file, there is such code present. But we also have a network tab, which essentially tells us what network requests are, essentially happening in the background processes. And here you can see I set a filter for JavaScript, 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 JavaScript. But there is also an all field, which means all requests will be shown here. And there is an XHR and fetch field, which means XMLHttpRequests and accordingly. Fetch requests will be shown. And if I apply a filter to these requests, we can see that there is a line with users. And let's expand it for now, meaning this is the request that went in the background. And for now, let's switch to the Headers tab to look at the information about this request. Here you can see that in the General section, we have a field called Request URL, and it contains a URL address to which we are making the request. Next, there is a field called Request Method, which indicates the method used to make the request. Which method? Yes, the get method. The status code is written, which means 200. That's good, along with various other parameters. Next, there is, for example, the response headers group. These are the headers, and we will get to them a bit later, but essentially there's certain metadata needed for requests so that client servers understand what is being communicated. Yes, and this is what is sent from the server, though we can see that. For example, the server that runs. On JSON, placeholder operates on Express. Yes, these are the advertising headers X powered by Express. And from this, we can understand that they are using express.js on node.js. Yes, accordingly, there's node.js. That's what runs JSON placeholder. And indeed it is because this service runs on the JSON server library, if we take a look at it. So it has a GitHub, yes, and here we have a description of this package. Basically, it's a popular library with 43,000 stars that essentially makes various fake requests. Let's get back to the headers. There are poly request headers that are the headers sent from our client. In this case, the client is our browser. There isn't as much information here as we would like. In the response field, we see the actual response from the server, which we will get to a little later. And in the preview field, we see the response that Chrome has parsed for us. That is, here we get an array consisting of objects of the users we received. In other words, we successfully made the request in the background and everything is working correctly. But we would like to somehow interact with this data, and so far we have no way. For example, to output it to the console or to iterate over the array. Therefore, to process this data, we can refer the XHR. And it is very important to do this before we send the request. Yes, because first we need to add a new listener. The more universal way in this case would be to use this notation. Define the onload function. Here I will use an arrow function, but it can also be a regular function where essentially we can already look at what the XHR response is in the console. Essentially, now if I refresh the page, we get the data we needed in the console. But here we need to note that it is actually not an object, but a string. Because if I write the type-off operator here and ask what it is, it will be a string, because over the network, and our data is moving around. This transmitted in string format. There can't be any objects there. And in JavaScript, we would like to interact specifically with objects. The simplest way to get objects here is to refer to the global JSON object and call its parse method. If we look now, you're no longer getting a string, but a real object we can work with. Alternatively, there is another option. We can avoid parsing the response ourselves. We can instruct the XHR object to properly parse the response. That is, we can write XHR response type and specify that we want a response type to be JSON. Response is the answer, and type accordingly is the type. So now, if I refresh the page, we still get an object here, while an array, yes, consisting of objects, but we can already interact with it inside JavaScript. You might also ask me how to handle errors. And actually, it is done in a very straightforward and simple manner. That is essentially, the XHR object has another function that we can define, which is commonly referred to as onError, Here we also define an arrow function, and usually we can, for example, just log some error to the console that might also be present in the XHR response. That is, if we get a successful response from the server, we end up in on mode. If there is an error, we will end up in on error, but the response can also be in the error. Therefore, if we refresh, everything works fine. But if, for example, we set the URL incorrectly, we get an error. And here is our console.log. Well, let's return the correct URL. And I also want to talk a bit more about errors, because there are situations when, for example, the server responds without an error, but it carries a status code that tells us the error has occurred. For example, such a user is not found in the database or something along those lines. However, we will not trigger on error because this is a different type of error, a network error. And to handle all potential errors more universally, we can also refer to the onload method and check if the XHR and its status field, which is the server's response status, is greater than or equal to 400. That is, anything above the 400 status. It's considered an error. For example, you might be familiar with the 404 code, which means something is not found. Or for instance, 401 indicates a lack of authorization. If the status code is greater than 400, then we can throw an error here. For example, write console error and also XHR response. Otherwise, display all of this in console log. So this is also a point to consider, but we can still refer to the status calmly, and everything will work. Now we see that essentially we are successfully sending to get method, but what about the post method? Let's immediately make this method more versatile, because essentially we are currently working with regular callbacks, and it doesn't look very elegant. It would be nice to incorporate, for example, promises, because with promises we can interact more conveniently when working with asynchronous code. Therefore, let's write a universal function. Let's say send request, and here I will execute all this logic. So we want the send request method to wrap all of this in a promise and eventually return a promise. That means we can immediately write return new promise. And if you are not familiar with promises, a prompt will appear now for a video where I explain in detail what promises are and how to interact with them. We are simply wrapping some asynchronous code, and this code is asynchronous because we are sending some data to the server and waiting for it to come back. And in this function, we receive two functions, namely resolve and reject, to be called the resolve method in the case of some success. In our case, this means XHR.response if the status code is less than 400. We call reject when there is some kind of error. In our case, we have two places. And that's basically it. Now the send request method is ready. Let's now make it accept some parameters. So the first parameter will be the method. The second parameter will be some URL, such as, for example. Now we can call the send request method with the get method and pass a URL address here. In our case, this is the request URL variable. But now this will work strangely because we are now accepting these parameters but not yet working with them. So instead of a static GT, we pass a dynamic method parameter here, and instead of request URL, we pass the URL. Now the send request method returns a promise and we can chain it, meaning we can call the then method where we will receive some data. Let's look at it in the console. And we will also handle the error using the catch method. If we have any error, we will log it to the console. We save, refresh the page, and we see that we still get the data we need, but now everything works through the convenient send request method, similar to what you might have seen in various libraries like jQuery. But we will get to that shortly. Now, regarding the post method, essentially JSON placeholder also allows sending post requests to the given URL and will respond with some static data. Let me copy this and comment it out. Here I will write the post method right away, but usually the post method should accept additional parameters called body, which is what the request is sent with. And so let's create a third parameter in the send request method here, which I will call, for example, body. And by default, it will be equal to 0, meaning if we are working with the get method, we won't need any body, and therefore we won't process it in any way. And in our case, considering that we are working with users, let's say, for the database, we will make it, well, first of all, it's an object, and let's say we make it like, let's say name is Vladilin, or for example, age is 26. That is, we will just make it a regular object. To make it clearer what is happening here, I will create a separate variable base and assign this value to it. And as the third parameter, I pass an object here. That is, the body of the request consists of objects. Now, how do we handle the given body in the sendRequest method? Essentially, we can just pass this object to the send method to also send some data over the network. But now, if we look and refresh the page, we basically got some response that says ID 11. But let's take a look at the network tab. First of all, we see that it has a status of 201. It's no longer 201 is the status for created. This means something has been created. And in this regard, JSON placeholder is not deceiving us. But if we scroll down a bit, we will see that the request payload is a string object. And actually, I have already explained in previous videos why this happens, because when we call the toString method on an object, it returns this string by default. In other words, the body we are sending over the network right now is not the body we would like. And indeed, we should not be sending JavaScript objects, but rather we should be sending a string here. For this, we can use the JSON_stringify method and wrap it in the body. Now, if we refresh the page and look at the users, Chrome parses the object in the request payload. Yes, and that's exactly what we need. But in the preview, we still don't get the data we want because the response from JSON placeholder should also send us this data. And so, let's take a look at the request headers, which are the headers that handle our request. We see that the content type header is set to text plain. Additionally, there is a charset UTF-8 parameter. This is the encoding, and we can ignore it for now. Importantly, we tell our requests that we are now working with plain text. But in reality, we are working with JSON because here we are converting it to a string. And therefore, we must explicitly specify that we are now sending some data that is in JSON format. This is done using XHR headers, so I access the object and say that I need to call the setRequestHeader method, that is, set the headers that are sent with the request. The first parameter is specifically the name of the header it is called, and its value should be application.json. Now, if we look at our request, I will refresh the page again. We have two requests being sent, where the first request is just a regular options request, which is completely empty. It has no response, and essentially it only serves to check if the server is available. Next, if we look, we have request headers, and the content type has already been changed to application.json. And now in the preview, we see how JSON placeholder responded with the same data, but it also returned an additional ID. So now our method works, and we can send asynchronous requests without libraries using basic XMLHttpRequest. Now let's do the following. I will create a new file called fetch.js and transfer everything I have written so far into it. And in the index.html file, I will now include the fetch method, the fetch.js file. Now we will discuss how we can make the same asynchronous requests, but using a relatively new and fresh API, the fetch method, which is available in browsers. Before that, I want to say that this method, using XHR, is more versatile because almost all browsers support it. This means you can use it confidently, and you will have the same code across all browsers. Here in the fetch method, I will essentially take and delete all of this because I will have one method, send request, and let's start with the get request. but I will write it using the fetch API. It's actually very simple. We have a method in the browser called fetch. When we call it, we should immediately understand that the fetch method returns a promise. Considering that sendRequest already returns a promise, we can immediately write return. Next. The first parameter of the fetch method is the URL, which is the address where we are making the request. And basically, this is enough for us to perform the get method, because by default the fetch method will perform the get method for us. But considering that we get a promise returned, we can immediately change it here using the then method. However, let's not do that for now and take a look at what we have in the console in the browser, refreshing. Page, and now we get this interesting object. So, we still don't have the data we would like to see. This is an array of users. We get an object called response. It refers to the global class from which this instance was created. Here, for example, various interesting data are present. For example, there is an object of request headers, a field OK that indicates whether there is an error in the request or not, a response status of 200, and, for instance, a URL. However, if we look at body, which we can reveal here, yes, it's a getter, we will see that body is actually a readable stream. And this is done in the name of optimization. So, for example, if we receive some large data from the server, it will receive it in stages, but we would like to see that array here, not a readable stream. So, what can we do? Considering that we can work with promises in different ways, in the sendRequest method we can immediately call in and get some response here. And we can call a method on the response as well. Yes, meaning this is what we get from the server, but wrapped. A fetch API. Here we can call a method called, for example, response.text. And she'll take this, redouble stream, and convert it to text for us. If we refresh the page, we instantly get the same line at the end of the console log that we got with XHR. So, you see, this is quite convenient, and now we can parse it. But it's not necessary to do this, because instead of the getText method, we can call the JSON method, which, by the way, also returns a promise. And if we refresh the page, we now get a ready set of objects here. So basically, we are done with this as well. And for the most part, that's all there is to the get method. Now let's deal with the post method in detail. He'll comment on this thoroughly, and I'll return it as well. Here we also pass the method and pass the body that we need to process. In the fetch method, this is also done very simply. That is, as the second parameter in the fetch method after the URL, we pass a configuration object where we specify parameters such as the method, which in our case equals the method. We can also specify the body here with the same story as with the previous option, where we need to wrap everything in JSON stringify. Parameters bad. And to specify some headers here, we write that we need the headers key. And let me just create a separate variable headers above, which by default will be an empty object. But actually, making it an empty object is not necessary, because to specify headers now, we can simply list all these headers here as key and value pairs. In our case, it is content type which equals application/JSON. And now if we save and refresh the page, we get the original console log while executing the post method. And lastly, what I would like to tell you in this lesson is how you can handle various errors. So, for example, we did get into this then, but there is some error in the response. Therefore, we can do the following here. We can ask, what if the response in its OK field, that is either the OK flag, or we can also use the status and say that it is greater, or less than 400, but I prefer to use the OK flag. Then we just return the JSON, and that's it. But otherwise, If there is some error and this flag is set to false, then I will definitely return the response JSON. But here I will need to generate an error. And considering that this is also a promise, I can call the then method here, where I get some error. And essentially, here I can already create some of my own logic, for example, my own error. That is, let's say I create an object E. This will be newer. Here we can come up with some text, for example, based on this text that we get in the error object, or some custom text like something went wrong. Next, let's say we can store an error object in eData, for example, to work with it later. And here, basically, use the throw operator to throw this error. So, for example, this is one of the ways we can do it using Fetch API. Yes, and now if we save, we still get our response because there are no network errors. So, as you can see, there is nothing complicated here either. All libraries, such as Axios or jQuery, are built on these two methods, which are native to the browser, and you can safely write similar logic without connecting additional libraries. But of course, they have their own specific bonuses, which you can read about on the official websites, for example. However, it is important to understand how this client-server interaction works in principle and how you can implement it yourself. Therefore, I hope this lesson was useful to you, and see you in other videos.